So what are we doing here today? Well, we're here to talk about AI and machine learning. You'll see, probably a lot of the acronyms AI and ML on some of the presentations. I think we put together a really fun event. We had two vendors speaking. Veritone, who's really a leader in this area. Cloud First is going to talk about some of the stuff that they're doing. And we got a little panel as well, with Peter from Rogers. And Ryan from Chorus, just talking a little bit about some of their experiences, what they're seeing as well around it. That's it. I'm not going to try and do any more than that because we have some really skilled people who are going to talk about all of this tonight, and we have a packed schedule. So we're going to try and get through it quickly. So for that, I'm going to introduce you to Paul Kramer. So Paul currently serves as Veritone's head of strategic partnerships. His tenures with media and entertainment spans over 2 decades, the last 18 of which include working with broadcasters and audio publishers to grow revenue and engagement using established and emerging digital tools and strategies. During his career, Kramer has had his firsthand experience leveraging almost every digital asset available to radio, including artificial intelligence, content management systems, loyalty marketing, online contesting, online research, email marketing, SMS, format specific, I think a lot. Before joining Veritone, Paul spent 10 years with Triniton Digital as Executive Vice President of Publisher Development for North America. Prior to Trinitron, Paul was VP of Sales for MGI Interactive. He's held a number of other positions as well. He currently resides in New York with his wife and his lovely 3 children. Please welcome Paul.
Great. Well, thanks for having me tonight. Really wanted to spend a little time talking about some very practical use cases in AI. I think a lot of what we hear about in AI is really this kind of forward-leaning, paradigm-shifting, future-looking vision. And I think that it's good to kind of break it down and say, what are we seeing? What are the top use cases our clients are doing and using today to provide you with some actionable things that you can take back to your companies and really look at as a first foray into AI adoption. So we'll really touch on those. Before we get into what are those use cases, let's talk about some of the trends that we're seeing in AI adoption today. So first and foremost, luckily we're not here yet. And although I do hear that cyborgs will be available by special order in Canadian Tire for the holiday season, but luckily killer drones and cyborgs are still a way off. That's really science fiction. But what is happening is we really have 3 different forms of artificial intelligence, 3 different categories of artificial intelligence that we're starting to be exposed to. So the first is something we call artificial narrow intelligence, or ANI. And a really good example of this is, Google through AlphaGo has built a model that can beat any human in the game of Alpha, better than any human, and it's very, very specific to that particular task. And what artificial narrow intelligence does is it's very accurate at one thing as long as we give it a very large corpus of data to be trained on. So another example of this is there's a really cool app, I think it's from nature.org, where you can snap a picture of any kind of plant and it will tell you exactly what genus of plant that leaf is from. If you take a picture, though, of your dog, it's just going to break the model, right, because it hasn't been trained on that. So that's a really good example of artificial narrow intelligence, which is also akin to a lot of our natural language processing and our speech recognition models, which we'll touch on. Where we're starting to move, though, is to something called artificial general intelligence. And artificial intelligence knows a lot about a lot, whereas narrow intelligence knows a lot about a little. And this is starting to approach the human mind, right, where it's starting to use different things and draw inferences. We have things such as interclass cognition, where you can use visual cues along with audible cues to start to form informed decisions about what's actually happening in the broadcast and so forth. And in the future, when I go back to that slide of the cyborg, we're going to have artificial superintelligence. And this is where it knows more than we'll ever know. Some pundits have said that, artificial intelligence is the last great things that humans are going to invent, because eventually the AI will start inventing its own AI. And that's a little bit scary, but we're definitely a ways off from that. So keep that in mind as we're kind of talking about these use cases, because I think it provides some great context. The other thing that we have happening right now when we look at artificial narrow intelligence is the number of different models that are out there. So if you roll back the clock a few years ago, we had about 5 different engines in 5 different cognitive categories. And by categories, I mean natural language processing and speech detection, facial recognition, on-screen or optical character recognition, and so forth. And this is kind of Moore's law in action. We're seeing this hockey stick growth of exponential innovation, where today we've got about 10,000 different engines. And that's just going to continue to exponentially grow until there'll be millions and millions of engines within the next decade. So we ask ourselves, if you're building an AI strategy, how do you connect to the right engines and know that the engines that you're using are currently best in class or the best for that particular use case that you have? And this presents a real challenge when you're looking at creating an AI strategy. I think we're going to touch on this a little bit in the panel later, but someone asked about connecting to big engine providers versus niche engine providers, and there's guys out there that are creating models in their basements in Southern California to identify tattoos. And you think, well, why would anybody build an AI model for tattoo recognition? Well, public safety and law enforcement, when they book these offenders and they bring them in, a lot of times they have tattoos and they want to be able to identify those tattoos to see if they're part of a larger gang, if they're seeing a pattern like, hey, we're booking all these people all of a sudden that have this tattoo that says X, Y, or Z, or that's in this shape. And so this is the beauty of these narrow engines, is that there's guys that have created tattoo identification engines that are very, very tightly tuned to some specific use cases. So the other thing that we're seeing is that AI is starting to amplify human effectiveness. And so we talk a little bit about being on the loop versus out of the loop. And I really want to spend a little time on this because this is really a big trend that I think you're going to see with AI in the next few years. So really in the past and sometime still in the present, humans have to be in the loop. And a loop is a process, right? So I'll give you an example of that. Driving a car, right? You have to be no distracted driving. You have to be in your car, paying attention, looking at what's happening around you, constantly adjusting, and truly operating that car. You are right in the middle of that loop when operating a car. What's starting to happen, though, we're starting to see autopilot with Tesla. We're starting to see adaptive cruise control and these sorts of things. So it's slowly taking the human from the middle of the loop and putting them on the loop, where the AI is starting to make the human more effective and amplify them and taking some of that control back. Eventually, as we all know, cars are going to become completely autonomous. That's when the human is out of the loop. So let's use that same metaphor, but let's use it with production, right? Right now, we've got clients that have to sit down and watch 4 hours of video to find out where all the live integrations were in play-by-play. That's a great example of a process that's in the loop. We're starting to move the human to the outside of the loop right now because the AI can go find all of those integrations and say, hey, here's the 30 integrations I found. I just need you to quickly verify that those are the correct integrations, and you can quickly say yes or no for recapping for ad intelligence. Again, in the future, that will be completely automated. A human won't have to look at it at all. So this is really important because one thing that I think has happened in media is there's more and more content being created, as we know. And if we look at that relationship down there, more and more content, the same amount of people, it's just not sustainable. And so what AI is going to help us do is to not eliminate jobs, but actually allow us to do our jobs more effectively and focus on more efficient use of those resources. One anecdotal story, I love this story. So I was at a holiday party a few months ago, and there's 2 radiologists there, and we were talking, and they found out I was in AI, and they said, everybody's got an AI story. So they said, oh, you're in AI, we got to tell you this story. Well, just the other day, the guy from Fuji stopped by our office, and he made this presentation. He said, look, we've got this new algorithm, this new machine. It can read the x-rays at 97% accuracy, and it costs 25 cents an x-ray to read it. You guys are going to want to get so invested in this. And they looked at the guy, and they quickly ushered him out the door. And I said, well, why did you do that? They said, because if we have this, then what do they need us for, right? So that's a great example of people being afraid about moving off of the loop. But the reality is that I would encourage people to look at this and say, if you had that technology, could you see more patients? Does it create more efficiency where you can actually make more money? Because it's not about replacing people. It's about, again, amplifying that human effectiveness. Last story on that note, if you look at what happened in agriculture, 200 years ago, 90% of the population was involved in agriculture to sustain the human race. 90%. Today, just 2% of the human race works in agriculture. Again, that's automation And I don't think any of us are upset that we're not out in the fields anymore with a hoe and doing all that kind of backbreaking work. So really AI is going to help increase those efficiencies within organizations. So let's get to the use cases. Lots and lots of use cases. One of the biggest things that we're seeing is using AI just for search and discovery. Think of all the content that still has to be discovered based on maybe some kind of file architecture system or some kind of time-based correlation, and it's really, really laborious to go back in that archived content and try and find either B-roll or clips, sound bites, scenes to send out, footage requests, social media, and so forth. Think about if some of you have been around a while, what web crawler did. If you remember back in the late 90s, web crawlers started to crawl the web and index the entire web so that text became searchable. Web crawler got bought by Yahoo, and we know what happened with Google and so forth, but we've indexed all of the text in the world. But all of our audio and video content is usually not searchable except if we put some tags and some metadata on that. You can't go onto YouTube and say, hey, find me the exact point in this video where this happened. All I could do is find videos that have certain tags on them or certain descriptions and so forth. So what AI is starting to do is index all of that audio video content, which is unstructured and linear, and being able to use that for internal search and discovery for your own workflows to be able to find content a lot more effectively, just like you use Google today. When we index that content, it then makes search and discovery a lot more efficient for external reasons as well. So some of you probably have licensing departments who field footage requests. You probably are sitting on massive, massive archives where it's just not practical to go back and find that footage when somebody's creating a documentary and wants to license some of that footage. And so once we index that content too, we're now seeing that AI is empowering that external search so that footage requests, rights management, licensing can be streamlined a lot more effectively so that that gold mine can really be mined and monetized as well too. Ad intelligence is a huge use case. And this team may or may not interface with the sales and advertising side of the house that much, but I could tell you that that side of the house is trying to figure out how do we do this. As advertising has become more data-driven, dollars are shifting to data-driven mediums. Ad budgets are no longer spent, they're now invested. And when you invest, you have to measure the ROI. And in order to measure ROI, you need analytics. So the folks out there that are responsible for bringing the dollars into our organizations, they're trying to figure out how do I compete against Google and Facebook that are taking the lion's share of the local media spend in each one of our markets. They're trying to justify that spend by being able to quantify a lot of what actually happens that's hard to quantify. A lot of what we do is either pre-produced or in logs, but a lot of the native integrations, the non-interruptive advertising is harder to track, such as product placements like those Tim Horton mugs up there, or naming rights to the sports desk. If I spend $600,000 on my local television station to sponsor the sports desk, what am I truly getting for that? Well, we say, oh, we're going to mention you every time we go to sports. We're going to put your logo up there. But if I can actually quantify that programmatically, marry that with numerous data and automate the whole process and go back to the advertiser and say, hey, this is what you got for your 600 grand, it makes it a lot easier to renew and retain that revenue and also sell other packages like that. So that's really a very big use case being used by research teams, strategic insights, brand partnerships teams, and of course the ad sales team as well too. Earned media, this is a really unique one. So we have a client in the US, big sports brand who you could probably infer who they are, but they go out and they sell event sponsorships. Those event sponsorships and naming rights get picked up in the broadcast, and that's earned media or added value. And the AI can go through all of that footage and say, hey, here's all the times that you bought the rink board or you bought whatever it might be, got shown in the broadcast, so we can quantify that now using logo recognition, on-screen character recognition, and so forth. So again, this relates to the ad intelligence use case, but it's a very specific subset of that as well. And this is one I really like. This is one that's getting a lot of attention now, is this idea of attribution. Again, in digital, we have no problems with attribution because it's IP delivered, it's trackable on a per user basis. But in broadcast, we've got this massive audience where we're creating lots of reach, lots of response, and then there's this disconnect between offline and online. How do we correlate those two things together? So again, AI is using these visioning techniques and different techniques to determine when an ad plays or when a live integration happens. and then it's looking at the corresponding lift in Google Analytics or Omniture or Adobe or social media lift to correlate those two things and again make traditional broadcast mediums a lot more effective today. Switching from the sales side of the house to the talent side of the house, this is a really interesting one for talent analysis and strategic content review. The talent office is often looking at ratings and what are driving ratings. For instance, how often is Anderson Cooper going to breaking news versus Wolf Blitzer, and how does that affect ratings? So this is really, really effective in a lot of ways, not only for ratings growth and retention, but also enforcing talent contracts. If you have a contract where you're only allowed to use that talent X number of times or X minutes a month, you're able to quantify that a lot easier versus, again, using human review, which would take very, very long to do so. So we're seeing this use case a lot as well. And then obviously over-the-air to digital extension. So important to be able to take that content that normally vaporizes when it goes over the air in a linear fashion and be able to push it to a medium where it's evergreen and being able to be repurposed. And so just being able to find those highlights, those clips, pushing to social media is a great use of using those AI-based search algorithms. This is one that I think is just in its infancy, but it's going to really start to make a big impact soon. Content extension from the standpoint of recommendation engines. Again, all of this great content that we sit on in our organizations, how do we make that discoverable? And when we create engagement with a viewer or a listener, how do we keep them connected to our brand versus going somewhere else? Well, the recommendation algorithms are part of that. But also the programmatic clipping of that content to recommend it to them is important too. Because if we have to go back through our archives and manually cut up all of these things, it's usually a process that's just too consuming for any person or too cost prohibitive for any organization to undertake. And so AI is starting to do programmatic clipping and then content recommendation engines so that we can serve that in a digital paradigm and monetize it further as well. This is another one that's really interesting that you may not think about, but I've seen this use case come up a few times, which is essentially a compliance and a brand safety moderation use case. So one of the groups I know has a law where they cannot air children's television programming adjacent to someone who appears in that children's programming in an ad. So basically, if you're starring in that programming, the law says you can also be in an ad adjacent to the programming. So they could set up facial recognition to identify that any of the content that they're shooting doesn't have that person in it before they serve an ad into there to be compliant with that. The other one is a really interesting one, which is brand safety. So as we take our linear content and we start to serve it digitally and we start to programmatically serve ads in there, there are a lot of concerns from certain advertisers that they may not want to be adjacent to something that's quote-unquote controversial, political, cannabis, whatever it might be. So you might have a completely brand-safe program or a podcast or a vlog or whatever it might be, but if you're programmatically serving ads in there, you want to know if that particular podcast has one of these topics in there that could be considered questionable so that the ad server doesn't serve something in there. So this is a use case that we've seen come up with different organizations that have tons of content that they can't manually curate it all, and they want to programmatically serve ads that the AI can help them do that and amplify their effectiveness. So given all those use cases, then the next question becomes, where do you start to implement this AI? There's so many use cases. The first recommendation I would make is don't try to boil the ocean. I've sat down with so many folks, and they really try to bite off more than is practical at that point in time. So, we'll hear things like, hey, it would be great if we could use the AI to identify all the faces that walk in the room, and then we can go ahead and recommend content based on that, and look at the right clips to serve them, and also tell the producers that they should be finding these clips. We're not there yet. That's kind of artificial superintelligence that we're moving there. Today, let's look at what processes we can make a lot more efficient in the organization, where we're starting to see some pain points and some pinch points in the organization, and use AI to start to relieve those pain points, and realize that when we start to index our content, that's just the start, because we can then start to add additional use cases on top of that once the content is indexed. You might have a use case of saying, hey, I need to create verbatim transcripts of our content. let's start there, and then afterwards, now that the content's indexed, you can go ahead and turn on a discovery feature for licensing and some of those other use cases we talked about. So really the top three things: what are the operational efficiencies and process improvements we can look at? How can we use this to augment revenue, the ad intelligence use case, the content discovery use case? And then again, number three, avoid the one-trick ponies. Future-proof your AI investment. If you think back to that slide of that hockey stick growth of all of those artificial intelligence engines that are out there, don't hitch your wagon to one particular engine or platform that's not going to be extensible as you want to grow, as you want to create your own engines or add other applications or even integrate with your existing systems in the future. You want to be able to accommodate all of those future use cases so that you're future-proof, because this AI rocket ship is taking off and it's going to go really, really fast. So that's about it. Are we doing questions or are we?
Yeah, why don't we grab a question maybe? We'll have more afterwards, but if anybody has one right away or back there.
Question in regards to how you're doing the recognition for ad detection. Do you have the ability to segment the time frame that would be allowable? Because obviously, if it was up there for a third of a second, it probably wouldn't be recognizable for humans, but the machine could register that as an instance. Are there filters that way to do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So any system you're looking at, you definitely want to have that functionality so you can look at duration on screen or duration in content and then set up rules around that. So if it's under a certain threshold, it doesn't count it, or you might even want to just be able to search for things that were on the screen for 30 seconds. You have that ability, which is really important.
And is that all in real time?
A lot of this is moving to the edge right now, so it is in real time, which is really, really cool, because in the past it was delayed. Probably 18 months ago, we were looking at about 15-minute delay, and now it's all moving to real-time edge processing, which is really cool. Yeah. Sure.
All right. Might be one more before we switch. All right. Great. Thank you.
Great.
Paul?
Thank you.
We're just getting ready for Brian. So let me introduce our next speaker, Brian. Brian is the CEO of a company called cloudfirst.io. Most of you may recognize him. He is a successful entrepreneur, thought leader, and innovator in the area of large-scale unstructured data storage, archive, and preservation. He founded CloudFirst in early 2018 after 3 years inside Oracle. Prior to this, he was CTO at Front Porch Digital for 13 years and helped guide the company through its acquisition by Oracle in 2014. He founded MassTech prior to that and began his career at the CBC more than 2 decades ago. He's one of the primary inventors of the SMPTE ISO AXF standard, and he and his team have won 2 Emmy Awards for innovation in digital video and long-term content preservation. Please join me in welcoming Brian to the stage. And Brian, what is ISO AXF?
Oh, don't get me started.
All right.
It's like asking me what I think about Air Canada. All right, so
Any Air Canada
move these down a little bit. Apologies. So hello. I'm going to actually talk about a little bit different side of, I guess, what was just introduced to you guys as more general concepts. So I'm taking more of a look of your legacy archives and how we can leverage machine learning and AI to essentially enhance value and accessibility to the content, sort of this concept of discovery. I'll skip over that. So in terms of trends and what we're seeing in the industry today, historically it's made the most sense to keep these large archives on-premise. The scale of data, an average digital archive today might be 10 or 20 petabytes of data. Historically, cloud has been extremely expensive. And latencies between accessing the content is quite a difficult challenge when you're looking for content today. There's been a lot of changes, as there have been on the client side, on the vendor side as well. One that Neil mentioned in my bio, that my company was acquired by Oracle some years ago. There's been another merger between another former company of mine, MassTech and SGL, a few years back. So a lot of these companies that have been traditionally providing these archive management solutions are, let's say, changing their direction and potentially introducing some uncertainties in the marketplace. From a user's perspective, I think the tolerance and expertise for maintaining these on-premise infrastructures has been an emerging challenge. Everybody's being asked to do more with less. There's floor space and real estate challenges as well, and budget challenges for maintaining these huge on-premise infrastructures. And in case you're not seeing the undertone here, this is really where the advent of these conversations are starting to embrace the idea of cloud, and cloud certainly leads into the topic today. To that end, most large organizations now are adopting a cloud-first type of methodology where they're looking at the cloud as one of the first options, disqualifying it before they start looking at other options like private cloud or on-premise in a traditional fashion. And if you're looking to lift and shift your entire digital archive into the cloud, it's still a TCO challenge. You still can't make the value proposition work. The math is getting better, but you still can't make it work. So ultimately what we're looking at is additional values. What is the reason why we're going to make this move if we're not justifying it only on real estate, floor space, staffing, et cetera, et cetera? Is there some other value prop that we can actually draw from this migration to the cloud? So in terms of a new paradigm now in the industry, I sort of alluded to this, but cloud storage costs are eroding significantly. I don't know if you guys are keeping track of what's happened in the cloud ecosystems, but AWS just announced Glacier Deep Archive about 4 or 5 months ago, and it just became commercially available in all regions, all North American regions, just about a month or so ago. This is $1,300 Canadian per petabyte per month to store your data in the cloud. So if you look at, if you're equipped, the most traditional way of storing this data on premise is LTO data tape. If you look at just the cost of media alone, that'll pay for about a year and a half of this service, in perpetuity. You don't have to worry about the software, the integrations. So it's getting to the cusp now where this value proposition is starting to make a little bit more sense. A lot of times that egress costs are a barrier to the, so for those of you that don't know, cloud is sort of based at, it's free to get your data in. You have to pay for your data at rest, so per gigabyte per month there's a fee, but then you usually have to pay to transact with that information. So if you're pulling it back, because all of your operations are still on premise, there's a toll to pull that data back. We've done a lot of analysis, a lot of data modeling, a lot of analysis for clients that we work with, and a lot of times most of our clients are overestimating how much data they actually utilize from their archive on a regular basis. So usually we try to look at what in practicality this means in your environment, and can we embrace the cloud to that benefit. Then where we start to really benefit is, again, about this value add. Can we leverage these cloud ecosystem components? So a lot of the stuff that Paul just talked about, a lot of the things that we're talking about with AI and ML aren't necessarily possible to do on premise. We've seen a lot of the transcoding engines also become available in the cloud as well. When you're looking for scalable, processing, transactional processing, it fits really well in a cloud ecosystem. Whereas, trying to rebuild this infrastructure on premise is a barrier for the capital investment that you need to make. So this idea of metadata enrichment or discovery of assets, especially important for these legacy archives. So this is really what we're talking about when we look at this value proposition. So if we're transitioning this archive into the cloud, can we gain additional insight in it? Can we do things like asset discovery? Can we make our assets, our archives more searchable? And in turn, can we lead to additional advertising revenue? Can we repurpose our content? Could we resell our content? Could we launch OTT platforms? So essentially being able to add additional monetization strategies to your legacy assets, just things that aren't possible today. So that sounds great, maybe, and to experiment with it, maybe try to play around with it. But the key point here is that still, as simple as it seems, there's organizations that are building entire businesses around stitching all these technologies together, because it's still not a terribly easy thing to do. So the same thing that you used to pay system integrators for back in the day to wire up your facilities and do things like that. If you listen to a presentation about cloud services from AWS, from Google, from Microsoft, it all sounds wonderful, but you get sort of given a bunch of APIs and a bunch of different ecosystem components, and it's up to you to sort of stitch those together into something meaningful, which in itself can present a significant challenge. So to that end, what we've done is we've released something called Media to Cloud. And effectively, we've partnered with AWS on this. It's a CloudFormation template, which you can deploy inside of AWS. Essentially, it enables end-to-end legacy archive migration to the cloud with all of these AI and ML capabilities around it to add value to your assets. It builds out all these complex workflows for metadata enrichment, populates a consumable metadata lake. So you might have heard this term before, but the idea is basically building a metadata repository that directly ties back into your content repository and gives you the capabilities to consume and interact with that content by APIs. The idea here is it's fully serverless, so you don't have to pay for machines or things like that in the cloud. So you essentially pay for what you use. And the idea here is to simplify the deployment to automate this discovery process. So all of this might actually sound like a sales pitch, but it's not a sales pitch, don't worry. What we've done is we've actually open sourced this. So effectively, it's something that anybody can access. There's no licensing fees or anything. Today, it only deploys in AWS because it was a co-development with them. But you can take this CloudFormation template and effectively deploy it in your AWS account and immediately have access to all these AI and ML services out of the gate with a comprehension of media assets and video and things like that. And I'll step you through some of the details here in a second. So one of the things I mentioned was this idea about deployment simplicity. And again, this is not necessarily a sales pitch for AWS, although they are nice enough to partially sponsor the event tonight. But the idea here behind this template is you can sign up for an account this afternoon or this evening, look for Media to Cloud and deploy it, and all of this capability is immediately accessible to you. So the idea basically is to give you this out-of-the-box experience where you can start to play and experiment with AI and ML around your video assets and without having to suffer through a lot of the complexities around it. So the general idea is again, when we're sort of tying it together as an end-to-end, we're looking at helping you to migrate your legacy archives into a cloud infrastructure. And while we're migrating those assets, kicking off all these cloud ecosystem components that help to enrich and add to discovery and allow you to do search and indexing and things like that. So we have an automated tool at the beginning here, but essentially what we're focusing on is the right-hand side when we jump into effectively into this AWS cloud ecosystem. So effectively, drivers into this cloud ecosystem is really what you would define as an asset. It's your content, so the actual essence, the audio and the video data, along with whatever metadata that we can actually pull through the process. So normally what we're doing to drive the input into this is we're pulling all of the potential legacy archive metadata, all the information that we can find from surrounding it. Sometimes it's just technical metadata. Sometimes it's about the object, the creation, what systems it came from, who created it. And effectively, those both get deposited, in this case, into an Amazon S3 bucket, which is the Amazon Simple Storage Service. And from there, there's an automated kickoff then that launches into the AWS Elemental to do a media convert. So that's effectively the transcode engine that generate an H.264 proxy. And then the H.264 proxy gets pushed into stateless functions within Amazon, which is recognition. So recognition, for those of you that aren't familiar, is the facial detection, the object detection, scene detection, on-screen character recognition engine. Comprehend is doing natural language processing and effectively gathering sentiment from the content. So, for newscasts, for sporting organizations, this could become quite a valuable tool. And then transcribe, which is obviously the speech-to-text capability as well. And then, as I mentioned before, all of that information gets dumped into a DynamoDB, which is effectively the metadata lake. And then from there, now you have API access into all of the enriched metadata that you can bring into the system. As I mentioned before, this is stateful. So when an object arrives here, the entire end-to-end process is automated. Because it's open source, you can grab that CloudFormation template and you can add and remove bits and pieces. You can change the engines. You can insert, using some of Amazon's capabilities, you can insert your own your AI models into these platforms as well and add those into the landscape. And even if you're not transitioning your content into this environment, so you're not or maybe your idea is not to maintain and persist your high resolution assets in this environment, you can also have a function that blows away all your high res after the proxies are generated. So it could just be a MAM to cloud type transition as an early onset thing where we're just transacting the high resolution data which is, with the exception of the network connection, it's free to get in there. As long as you don't hold it there for months at a time, you're not paying for months of storage costs. So at a high level, this might look kind of easy, but we've done a lot of development around this, and I'll sort of walk you through some of that. So again, what I mentioned before is the input to this whole entire process is effectively the legacy archive or the legacy metadata that we can bring along with the object. It's all in JSON format, and there's just a little snippet of some of the JSON code. So the idea is basically, persisting all of this, and this could be, an Avid project. This could be a finished, MXF OP1A asset. It could be 500,000 frame DPX asset, frame by frame. All of that information is sort of deposited in. What happens with our system is that we sort of validate that asset. So once we've transferred the content up into this cloud storage bucket, we'll revalidate against the checksums and the hashes that we have from the on-premise infrastructure. And only when that asset has been validated from end to end, then we'll generate the JSON, which effectively then kicks off all of this automated machine learning and AI process. You may have heard of Lambda inside of AWS if you've done any development work in that. That's their serverless triggers. So effectively, as complex as this whole entire environment is, what's happening is that we're depositing a couple files into a storage bucket that happens to be up in the cloud. And then a bunch of automated things are happening as part of that process that you guys can control and define. And then all of the metadata, the original legacy archive metadata, plus all of the generated metadata, asynchronously, of course, because some assets could take seconds, minutes, hours to process, get deposited into this data lake, and you then have sort of ubiquitous access to it. It's not exactly the highest resolution diagram. I apologize for that, but this is the 15 AWS services that we had to stitch together to pull this process together. So this spans everything from Lambda functions, DynamoDB. This includes their IoT, which is the messaging and the MQTT buses, for those of you that care about that geeky stuff. The API gateway, we've tied in Cognito, which is their user authentication, encryption tools as well, step functions, and then the different storage tiers, S3, Glacier, and Glacier Deep Archive as well. So I assume you can see that sort of stitching this together is the complexities around bringing these solutions together. Obviously, companies like Veritone, they have this sort of larger value proposition which spans multi-cloud, multi-vendor type deployments as well. But this was really, we started just as a sort of a proof of concept for trying to automate this end-to-end process, helping clients to see a path to the cloud. And what we ended up with was something that ended up being pretty cool at the end of it. So we first presented this at IBC last September, and then we officially launched it about a month before NAB this year. And I would encourage anybody that's looking to start playing with it. This doesn't have to be an all or nothing. Again, because it's a serverless, unless you're processing something, it doesn't cost you anything. So you can set up your account, you can deploy this CloudFormation template, and until you drop in your first home movie, you're not going to get paid. You're not going to pay anything. And usually, depending on the account type that you set up, they usually give you some free credits anyway, so you can sort of start playing and experimenting with it. Probably before you open the floodgates and start pushing all of your data, you might want to be a little bit more investigative in terms of the cost of all of this. And I'll talk about that maybe a little bit later on the panel if anybody's interested in how this all sort of stitches together. For those of you that have ever tried to do a TCO model about cloud, it's a very, very complex sort of mathematical science to try to figure out all the different things that you might need to pay for in this process. And then ultimately what we've done is we've built a simple UI on top of this, which is kind of like I don't even want to call it a MAM light to fear insulting the MAM people, but effectively it'll show you all the videos that you put up. In sort of a thumbnail, you can play them in the browser. This uses CloudFront too, so if you wanted to launch your own CDN service, you can here. And then you'll see things like tags that come up, object tags and facial detections. I think out of the box recognition now has detection for something like 100,000 celebrities built into the system. They can detect trees and cars and rainy days and viewer sentiment and aggression and things like that. And all that's just simply searchable through a little search box up there as well. And then past this, we actually brought one of our MAM partners on this is a company called Levels Beyond, for those of you that are familiar with them. And effectively, they built a fully cloud-based UI on top of this metadata lake in a matter of about a week or so, consuming all the metadata that was being delivered from the system. So effectively, what we were showing was from a legacy archive system and a data tape sitting in a data tape robot to this full index searchable to the question before, timeline index, so you can see how long each car was on the screen or whatever else. And then relating it right back to the original barcode of the data tape and the original metadata that came in from the legacy archive system, including UUIDs if you have other MAM and orchestration workflows that you have in operation. So if you want some additional information, here's our some references, and I think you'll have those available after the presentation as well. And source code is available on GitHub for anybody that wants to go and play around with it, and I encourage you to start playing. It doesn't cost you anything, or it costs you very little until you really start getting into some massive processing here, but it's nice to see what the capabilities of the systems will be. I think the general reaction is a lot of times out of the box, it's a little bit disappointing, but you have these huge capabilities inside these engines, and sometimes it's just about fine-tuning. Do I think it's worth you taking all of your legacy production content and pushing it through these workflows? Maybe not, because you probably have, through scripting, through captioning, you probably have quite a bit of searchable data. But if you have sporting content, if you have news archives, if you have creative raw materials that you haven't dealt with in the past, certainly could help you add some value to your archives. So thank you.
Question. One of the key things that we wanted Brian to talk about was showing you what an infrastructure needs to look like, right? We're used to a lot of our on-premise infrastructures, and yes, you can go and play, but there's some real complexities to get there. It's not as simple as an easy turn on, until you have partners like Veritone, Cloud First, or through AWS, there's a real complexity layer that you have to get through, and a big learning. Any quick question for Brian? Sean?
Brian, have you worked with Google using their Envato tool set?
We're doing some work in the labs right now. We don't have an immediate similar plan with this, but we are working with a client today that we're migrating both to AWS and Google for cloud diversification, and this is going to be part of their deployment as well.
Okay, so we've assembled what we think is a crack team here to help answer all of your AI and ML questions. So we already know Brian and met Mr. Kramer as well. So allow me to introduce, right to my immediate left, Mr. Pierre Fortin. He is the Vice President of Media Technology and Operations at Rogers Media, overseeing all production and content distribution for Rogers Sports and non-sports television, as well as technology teams supporting TV and radio. Pierre joined Rogers Media in 2015 with a mandate to modernize technologies and improve operations. For those who are part of SMPTE and were at the December event, I think we saw just how well Pierre and the team at Rogers are really starting to do that. Prior to joining Rogers Media, he spent 5 years in the enterprise group at Rogers, leading the sales engineering teams. Something I learned today.
Yeah, there you go.
That's right. And next to Pierre is Mr. Marchand, Mr. Ryan Marchand. He is the Director of Product Development and Strategy at Chorus Entertainment, Canada's largest pure-play media company. An executive with more than 10 years' experience in the broadcast and distribution industry, Ryan leads product development and strategy for the data and advanced advertising teams at Chorus. This team is comprised of more than 35 people focused on the use of data and emerging technologies across TV and digital media, with a mandate to drive revenue growth and innovation within Chorus. So please join me in welcoming to the stage as well. All right, guys, we're going to start with some softballs because we said we would.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, on that. So, we heard a lot about, different applications that can be used in those. Can you give us a couple examples of one or two of the projects that you're dabbling in today with AI and machine learning? We're going to start with the wireless mic
Yes.
with Pierre.
This strangely looks like that automaton that'll
It
kill
does,
us all
actually,
soon.
doesn't it?
So we are definitely not attempting to boil the ocean. The complexities around AI/ML are enormous, and so for us, we're just looking for practical use cases that make a lot of sense. The two that come to mind where we're kind of early stage development on implementation is the first is around telemetry data in our network operations environment. As more and more of our services move to hyperconverged compute and networks and that sort of stuff, the challenge you have when there's a major incident is your time to recovery can be pretty significant as you pour through logs and figure out what the issues are. And so increasingly, we need the use of advanced AI/ML to help correlate all of this log information in real time and reduce our time to response for the business. So that's an area that we're starting to just initially explore. We're probably going to be doing some RFIs in a little bit on that sort of thing. The other area that's kind of maybe more classically media-centric is around sports highlights and production. We at Sportsnet process thousands of hours of content every month, and to extract kind of meaningful highlight from all of those shows or all those events is incredibly labor intensive, and frankly, there's more we don't log than there is that we do, and so whatever doesn't get logged gets kind of superficially cataloged and stored, and oftentimes you lose storytelling angles in that kind of lack of ability to process the content. So we are also early stages looking at using algorithmic logging engines to that do a bunch of stuff really that take the live inbound video feed, do visual analysis of it, do audio analysis to listen to crowd level intensity and that sort of stuff, and also data feeds. Most of the major sports leagues have data feeds available that'll give you statistical information on who assisted, who scored, that sort of stuff. So there's systems out there that combine all of this information and basically log the event in real time and are able to build packages and document it. And that's really cool because it can, for kind of tier 2, tier 3 sporting events, you can have it run automatically and create highlight packages that then push to social, and it allows you to provide a lot more coverage than you would with your people. One of the vendors calls it's like giving your production team superpowers, which is kind of on theme a little bit. It's I guess that would be on the loop, right? So anyway, so those are two that we're kind of working on. There's a lot more. We're looking at a ton of different things, but those are the two that kind of stick out for me.
And Ryan?
Sure. So I just want to thank Paul for doing a lot of the legwork on some of the interesting applications. I do represent the ad sales side of the house in a lot of the work that I do, so I work pretty directly in between the technology team, which is why I'm thankful to be here representing some of the work that Eric and Sean and team are doing on the technology side, as well as with the sales side of the business to think about applications where we can monetize some of this technology either through process automation or creating some competitive advantages. Some of the examples that you touched on around object recognition or text recognition to create contextually relevant moments for advertising is something that's incredibly hard to do at scale. When you think about the amount of content that Chorus creates or broadcasts on a daily basis, helping an advertiser or a salesperson craft a campaign that's actually on message that reaches an intended target in content can be extremely laborious. So we're using some of the vision detection engine and some of the contextual keyword categorization to create moments in advertising where we can precisely place an advertiser, whether that's through lower thirds or through adjacent pod placements, right in content that is both relevant for the advertiser and relevant for the consumer. And we're bringing some of those products to market both in the linear space and in the digital space. And that's a way where we're taking the expertise of humans in the loop and applying and giving them so much more ability to do their jobs really, really well. The second one that we're working on that we're pretty excited about is with a local Toronto company where we have a relatively robust set-top box data collection program, and we have a lot of viewership data and a ton of historical, both cost data, the numerous ratings data, and we're using that to try to enhance the way that we promote our content to engaged viewers. A lot of what we're doing is trying to understand past viewing behaviors and patterns of viewers of a particular show, and understanding the attributes of that person who's viewing, the times of day that they tend to be viewing, the content that they tend to be viewing. We can better align our promotional strategies with content and promos that we think are going to be both relevant to the people who we're trying to get in touch with and find more viewers. So if we can identify individuals that are likely to like a show because they exhibit similar behavior of viewers of that show, then we can craft promotional schedules and inject those promotional schedules back down into our systems to try to make that process of scheduling promos for hundreds and hundreds of shows every single day a little bit more effective and a little bit more engaging.
Great, fantastic, thank you very much. Two completely different, points of view around how they're using them today, both at Rogers and Chorus. Got a question for Paul. Paul, there's a lot here, right? When we think about AI, we saw Brian slide. My head hurt a little bit from it, I'm not going to lie. What do you think the appropriate first step is for an organization to realize, look, we got to start now before we get left behind? What's the first step that they should be taking in their journey?
That's a great question. I think we touched on a little bit. I love the analogy of boiling the ocean and also identifying use cases that create efficiency, organizational efficiency, and revenue, and just starting out small. But I think another really good analogy to look at is what happened with personal computing, and so that you're investing in an ecosystem. By that I mean, really back in the day when we had mainframe computers, you had a lot of proprietary systems. And then Bill Gates came along, and what did he give us? He gave us Microsoft Windows. And what did Windows do? It really normalized application layer and the peripheral layer. And by peripheral layer, in our computers we have hard drives. I don't know if it's Hitachi who makes hard drives now or SanDisk or whoever. Most of us don't know because that normalization layer of the operating system manages that for us. On top of that, we have applications that are very, very specific. But I think investing in a system that's going to allow you to be able to take, for instance, any engine, whether it's through Amazon Recognition or Google or IBM Watson or something specialized like Nuance or Speechmatics, use the data feeds of crowd interests, let's say, in a play-by-play broadcast and be able to merge that in, be able to layer proprietary applications just like Microsoft had Word and PowerPoint, or third-party applications like WordPerfect if you didn't want to use one of theirs. That's really big. So I think looking at investing not in just solving one use case, but creating an ecosystem that's extensible for the future should be a really big part of that consideration.
Great. And Brian, you gave some really great examples of the application itself. Can you provide any insight into what you found the biggest roadblocks were as you were attempting this, or what are people going to have to watch out for, the gremlins, if you will, as you start to move into this world?
Well, that's a big question. I think we're sort of dealing with this again from an end-to-end, where we're looking at a transition from a legacy archive, large scale, into this cloud infrastructure with the augmentation of this AI and ML part of it. I would say if I'm focusing just on the AI and ML challenges, I'd say that cost is one of the first things that you need to look at. I mentioned that to look across the cost landscape of seconds of processing and bytes of this and frames of that and images here, all of these, the 15 or so different elements that we use in our media to cloud solution are all priced in a different way. API calls or frames processes or bytes processed or things like that. So what we did was kind of did the math to figure out this whole entire end-to-end chain and came up with a number around $30 per hour of content processed through the entire life cycle. And then, of course, added on top of that is if you're persisting the high res in S3 or in Glacier or Glacier Deep Archive, that becomes additive. But the good thing is that, you know, if we look back at that $30 an hour, you know, again, very rough number, the bulk of the cost is in, you know, the transcoding and then in the per frame analysis to do object detection and, you know, the voice to, text, speech to text. But what we can do is if having a transcript, a searchable transcript is more important to you than analyzing every single frame of video, we can set the H.264 transcoder to do 5 frames per second or 2 frames per second and extract the entire audio track. So you're paying a lot less for the image and object detection, everything like that, because maybe you don't need 30 frame resolution on that metadata. You know, if there's a Coke can in the image, it's probably not just going to be there for 1 frame. So you're likely not going to miss it. And maybe you don't care if it's there for, you know, 12 seconds and 18 frames. You care if it's 12 or 13 seconds. So if you're happy with a higher resolution view of your data, you can cut those costs significantly. I mean, if you do just simply half the frame rate, that's half the cost effectively. You do 1/10 the frame rate, now you're down to maybe $3 an hour for processing. So, you know, the audio tends to be the biggest key when you're looking at facial recognition and object detection. Much lower resolution in terms of, you know, frame rates is probably a good way. So understanding that end-to-end picture, the scenario, working with the clients to try to figure out whether they want to persist their high-resolution assets there, if they have a global cloud strategy, or they're just looking for this sort of deep valuation of their assets through metadata augmentation. You know, a lot of things to think about for sure.
Great, thank you. Any questions so far we got one in the back, Rain?
Yeah, I'm curious, outside of the data science side of these applications, have you looked at or explored applications such as image processing? We've got deep learning-based scalers, we've got image corrections, we've got damaged images, frame rate conversion. Is that anybody applying any of that in your facilities yet?
First of all, is anybody? The answer is no. Oh, Paul?
We're not, but what I don't want this to be a sales pitch, but what we've done with our system is we allow any third-party application or any third-party AI engine providers to be onboarded to the system. So if all of your content is indexed by our system and you have a use case like that, you can actually deploy that engine on top of the system to start to do those things, which is pretty nice.
Well, at least an interesting question, because you talked about third parties. Just bear in mind, we consult in the space and manage space, and we get this question almost every day from our clients, which is they are just getting massive amounts of hits from a number of companies who say they're now an AI provider. And you know, there's a real difference between I could go home tonight, start a company, grab Amazon Cloud Services, and charge $5 on the hour extra, and say that I'm an AI provider. What would you give advice around how do you distinguish between those who are just effectively, you know, reselling it, if you will, and with a markup, versus those who are actually true providers and innovators?
Yeah, I think it's important to differentiate between an engine provider and an application provider. So there's a lot of companies out there that are doing really great data science work, and they're really focused on being engine providers, and they have really big data science teams to focus on those narrow artificial intelligence engines that we had talked about. A lot of providers who are taking those engines and those components and creating value out of them, I think that's the big difference, you know. And so, you know, there's, for instance, orchestration of those engines, which is pretty neat, and we can go off on a whole different tangent about ensemble learning. The orchestration is actually different than ensemble learning because it picks the right combination of engines to use without having to run your content through every engine in parallel. So things like that are a great example of a value-added reseller who's providing orchestration or building specific applications on top of those engine providers.
The only thing I'd add to that is, like, there are some simple things people can do, right? You can ask the question, how is your infrastructure built? Who are your partners? How did you come to this? Do a little bit of your own research. The work that we're doing involves services from Google. It involves services from Amazon, just as much as it involves custom model building with local Toronto folks, We have some work that we're doing with Queen's University. They're investing in their students. They built a Masters of Management in AI program. Like, they're training students to come out and do some of this. We're trying to bring those people in, teach them a little bit of the business side, take advantage of some of their expertise. So just doing a little bit of the digging that you guys are all super trained to do, to get a little bit under how did you come to this, what services are you providing, taking that 30 minutes to get a little bit deeper, to make sure that you've got some trusted partners. We've done the same thing in picking some partners, but also in-housing some of it is a pretty safe first step to make sure that you're not subject to Neil's $5 markup.
That's right. It's actually $7.50 US. Any other questions?
Yeah, I'm kind of trying to figure out something. Are we overusing the word AI on something that's supposed to be just a routine or subroutine?
100%. Yeah, 100%. I think
AI sounds cool.
it does sound cool. It's a
So is
really
that-
big umbrella term. Pardon me?
Is it false publicity? Or
I think it depends on what you're doing and who you're doing it with. AI has become a really commonplace moniker, like agile transformations were, like project delivery was. So you have to find some people either within your org or partners that are willing to take some time to educate you. I know internally we have a couple of people who started to develop the internal subject matter expertise and reorient people away from the idea of just AI to what does machine learning actually mean, to how does this differentiate itself between like just statistical modeling and advanced statistical modeling and just creating some subroutines. There are some things you can think about in terms of, are we just looking at historical data and making some inferences? Are we truly using predictive models to try to look out into the future? Is there actual learning going on with data that's coming in reinforced? So even just coming right back to how the data is classified and what you're using it for, there's some pretty good indicators about how you can get away from just, hey, we're doing AI, to what are you actually doing, and how are you actually applying what's truly under there?
I think Ryan makes a really good point. And to your question, I can make the case that my garage door opener has AI, because when it's closing and the dog runs through, it uses visioning technology to open, right? And I'm sure that it won't be long before we hear that. But
it's not improving itself.
no, you're right, and that's the case. So, I talked a little bit about orchestration. You touched on reinforcement learning. That's a really big piece of this as well, too. So I think that's where the AI really comes in, as the models improve over time, as they choose to what machine learning models to use. That's the actual AI in the process.
We've seen some with like call centers where the AI is actually being used to detect the sentiment in the voice, and then it looks at how much money you've been worth to the company, and then starts to figure out what offers it should give you for retention. So it evaluates your emotional state. It looks and says, how much money we made from them so far, what's the likelihood they're going to leave, and then starts to feed to the human as a coworker, if you will, on how to handle that situation best and what to give. So next time you call Rogers, give Sam. So speaking about trying to get a job at Rogers, Pierre, maybe you could help us out. I mean, one of the challenges I think especially for the SMPTE group in traditional engineering, is what are the skill sets that we're looking for now? What should people start to learn about? Where should they try to spend a little bit of time to try to transition from our traditional engineering, as we have, into more IP based, which we are, and now into this next realm? What kind of skills do you think that you're looking for? And I'll look for Brian and others to also add.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for the softball, Neil.
I told you.
Jeez.
I said the first one was soft.
Yeah, that's right.
That's right.
Well, DevOps is probably one of the first thing that I would suggest is something that is essential. I know we're in early stages of transforming our own organization, but it's an interesting observation that your presentation, Brian, had like snippets of JSON blobs in the PowerPoint slide. I mean, being able to understand unstructured JavaScript objects and that sort of stuff, and so I mean I would start there, and frankly, Most of our engineering staff are great people. They're tinkerers at heart, and this is just the biggest sandbox that's ever been given to them. So, if you want to self-learn on some things like this, you can get very cost-effective or free trial accounts on AWS and that sort of thing, and just play in the environment. But developers, programming skill sets, that's the kind of stuff. When you get into kind of big data, that's very specialized. I don't know that that's something you necessarily would just teach yourself. I guess if you want to be a data scientist, you can go back to school and learn the principles there. But, that's not necessarily, if we need data scientists, we'll probably just hire data scientists, if I'm being honest with you. But the modern engineer in a media facility is able to code, is able to stitch together APIs in automated BPMN engines and that sort of stuff. You're not connecting equipment anymore. It's all happening through pseudowire and code. So that's really what the skills requirements are nowadays. That's what I'm looking for.
Yeah, we'll just keep passing this down. We were talking a little bit earlier outside in the hall. Media workflow is incredibly complicated, and I don't think that a lot of folks outside of this room, and I'll include myself in that, I know just enough to be dangerous about a lot of this, which Sean will attest to. That's why he's here to keep me honest tonight. So what I would say is having that as a foundation, as sort of a relatively unteachable, from an educational perspective, set of skills, that deep knowledge, paired together with some basic code writing skills like fluency in Python, starts to create a really valuable skill set where you can branch out and work both on the sort of traditional broadcast engineering side, as well as start to pull some of the functionality that's coming out of this space into that workflow to create some really powerful stuff, whether that's on metadata creation all the way through to advertising applications. A 60-second version of a story that represents Eric. In Eric's spare time, I don't know where he's the gentleman supposed to be speaking here tonight, decided to sit down and write some mathematical algorithms that would allow him to take advantage of some natural language processing and some machine learning algorithms and some historical Toronto real estate data to predict housing prices based on the features of that house in Toronto. So he said, if it has 2 bedrooms and a fireplace and it's here, and he did that using voice commands all up on screen as a presentation to a bunch of our executive team. So just that tinkering spirit that you were talking about in terms of just, I want to see what happens here. That took him a credit card, and I think the first iteration took him 60 hours. He didn't know Python when he started, and now he knows it. So that is just a great way to go, hey, this is something I'm interested in. How can I apply it to my real life?
Sounds like my old basic of 10, print hello, 20, repeat. 10.
Precisely correct.
Sounds like I'm already primed for AI, guys.
This AI company that you're starting.
That's right. Check it out later.
Yeah.
It's now $9.95. Paul?
Yeah, I really agree. I mean, I think it's a treadmill, and it's just, it's the make versus buy decision of, what part do you want to outsource, what part do you want to insource? Maybe it's a combination of both. And staying on that treadmill is an investment, though. It's rapidly changing, so I think that's an important consideration when you're looking at that.
Any other questions? Sorry, right there in the red.
Hi, I have a question about startup ideation and how machine learning or deep learning has affected that.
So in other words, do we think it's opened up the doors for barrier to entry?
Has it changed the ideation of startups?
An interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think that, from a marketing buzz perspective, it's certainly been a significant part of just about every startup that I've heard about. Well, that and blockchain for the last, 5 years or so. I think maybe to sort of turn your question around, I think the cloud has had much more significant impact on the startups than specifically just the AI and ML portion of it. Sort of going back over my 20 years of doing startups and entrepreneurship, when I started Mastech back in the late 90s, we, within a couple of years, we were spending hundreds of thousands of dollars a year on, servers and operating systems and people to manage them in data center, in our own rack rooms and things like that. And, as was the example here with Eric, you can go home now, learn something online for free or for $10, and then recreate Netflix in AWS in a matter of, weeks of time, where it just was an impossibility before. So, I think the doors that have been opened up by cloud is significant. I think everybody goes through this growing pain when you're looking at starting up a business, especially around tech. I'll only speak from technology, of course, but when you're starting up a technology company, obviously you're trying to take the path of least resistance to your first MVP, maybe your first paying customer, ideally. There's potential pitfalls in that as well, and I think if you read about the history of Netflix, they've gone through that pitfall, right? So you do something, you decide that that's not the right path, you redivert, you hook up. In their case, they were very lucky to connect with AWS from a strategic perspective, but then they leveraged just about every single API and tool that AWS had in their ecosystem, and by the end of the day, they had hundreds of millions of clients, but they were locked to AWS. So, that would be the other thing. About this sort of perpetual treadmill, or if, you're tinkering inside your organization, try to understand what your end strategy is. If you're trying to recreate, Microsoft Word, it might just be better to go and buy a license of Microsoft Word and spend your time doing things that are more important to the core of your business. We've seen, case after case after case where customers try to invent their own solutions, and you end up with, $1 million solution to a $100,000 problem. And it's perpetual forever until those people retire. And then you end up spending the money at the end of the day anyway. So, that would be kind of my opinion on it. I don't know if I answered your question at all, but.
Another question in the back.
Yeah, just wondering, on the project management side of things, going with Pierre's comment, it's a big sandbox now. I used to come up with a fairly finite statement of work. You go out for the project, you deliver on those milestones and so on and so forth. Now you have one idea that can turn into 10, those 10 turn into 100. How has that changed your project management strategy, I guess, in delivering a project?
Well, I guess you really sharpen your ability to focus on what matters. It's very, very, very easy to get distracted. There's, to your point, potentially hundreds, if not thousands, of shiny objects in that sandbox. And it's one thing if you're doing on your own time to learn and expand your horizons and broaden your skill set, but time is money in business, and you got to focus on what matters. I would suggest that's as much of a management problem as it is anything else. Really, it's the ability to kind of really focus your team and the resources on what's going to make a difference in your business. I have an idea a minute, and I have to check myself constantly because I'm mindful of our capacity as a business to execute, and we got to focus on the stuff that really matters. We've built a large national media operations center for those of you who visited it, and the sheer amount of systems we've put into place is quite staggering. And so one of the imperatives, the projects I was talking about, is being able to support these super complex ecosystems while continuing to run the legacy business. There's just they're not going to give me the budget and headcount to do that, so we need to use technology to do it. So that's like laser focused on that objective, and don't get distracted with all the other stuff around it. It's a management issue more than anything.
Yeah, I'll try to do a twofer here. One, on the startup ideation thing, what I would say is it's been helpful for me as a lifelong lover of shiny objects. The kinds of tools that we have access to now, because big tech companies have created this stuff and academia has made some serious strides in the last few years, it's still just another tool. It's still just another means to an end, especially this stuff right now where it can't be thought of as the end state. And so to that point about how do you not get sidetracked, we try to be really diligent about a split between these are some hardcore concrete use cases that either have process efficiencies or revenue generation opportunities And when we seek funding to do those, we're quite specific about those things. And where we're in an exploration phase where we believe that there's a seed of an idea, we will be pretty explicit about that, and we'll time box them, and we'll say, let's give ourselves 8 weeks or 10 weeks or 3 months or 6 months to explore a thing. And if that thing turns out to be a really grand idea, then we'll try to put some more resources behind it, and we'll come back to executive teams or steering committees and say, this is what we learned, this is what we found out, do we want to continue? And we've gone so far as to build some of those checks into our contractual agreements with vendors, where they'll be seeking year-long or 2-year-long agreements to tackle large problems. Where we're unsure of the outcome, we will build in 6-month or 3-month checkpoints as appropriate, where there are some kind of out with notice, just to try to protect both sides of the organization from a practicality point of view.
This is definitely where you can't use waterfall. You definitely want to be using more agile project management around those. We also encourage, by the way, if you ever get a chance to participate in a hackathon, I mean, those are really fun and innovative idea things where you can see some really cool stuff. We saw one with Microsoft where they invented, one team at Abbey Road in the UK, they actually invented like an AI bot that could rap battle you. Yeah, it was pretty cool. And they'll be bringing that out in the near future. It's just a fun little tool that's going on out there. Yep.
Just to piggyback on the project management and the business focus remarks, as we're heading into this threshold of cloud capabilities and AI really exponentially increasing what we can do you think that creates the opportunity for tech solution providers or tech divisions in organizations to stop being regarded so much as cost centers and more as an area of thought leadership in organizations? Will we ever get to that point?
Do you want to go first? Oh, sure. Since my CTO is in the room, I'll say yes, absolutely. But the truth is, yeah, 100%. So I came from the technology side of the business. I have the opportunity now to work on the sales side of the business. I think where people so often misstep is think of engineering or IT organizations as service partners or operational partners. So often proofs of concepts can seem really brilliant but have no capabilities to scale or no organizational support from a cost point of view or a resource point of view. So even through the budget planning process, we're quite diligent in reaching out to all of those people to understand resource commitments, to understand cost implications, and to tell a much more comprehensive story of both business impact and cost and human capital impact. When we took the AI narrative to the executive team, we came at it from a security point of view, from an engineering point of view, from a monetization point of view, and we told that entire story and said these are where the impacts are going to be. And I think we've tried to shift away from ownership of those ideas to a bit of a much more collaborative, much more team-based approach. And I think that's where we've seen some success there. So I do think that that's both necessary and possible.
Nothing will ground you more than taking your great idea to the CFO and having him say, yes, so what? What I like to think is, you know, if you're going to be presenting yourself as a value creator to the business, you need to ask yourselves the same questions that, you know, your CFO will ask. So what? What does this do for me? What does it save? What does it create as new revenue streams? You know, the typical business questions. I would suggest that's not a muscle that's typical in this community historically. And if you want to reposition a technology organization to be seen as that, then it starts with that kind of culture shift. So, you know, in talking about playing in a sandbox and getting your AWS account spun up so you can explore with code, maybe also take a finance for non-financial people course while you're there. Just food for thought.
It's a great plan. John in black.
I was curious about what you were saying about the audience, right? How you were measuring their faces and whatnot. Have you been able to measure their faces to show the emotion that they feel
So you're talking about like the television viewing audience?
Like, let's say we're watching the UFC fight.
Oh, you mean the audience in the crowd?
Yeah.
Yes, okay, yeah.
So like, can you apply their emotions to certain events, to certain things that would show up based on that emotion that they're experiencing?
So I know of a really good use case of that. We were open to having, and I think there's a gentleman in the crowd actually probably can tell it better, but there is one company that did that with the tennis matches, and they were actually able to use the facial expressions as well as the noise to realize there was a really good highlight in the tennis match, and they would auto package that as a clip and then promote it to social media right away. And it was a way to drive people back to the linear broadcast or to actually watch the match itself. We're seeing that as well in Latin America and soccer, or sorry, football. In Latin America, the same kind of thing based on that, the crowd reactions and those. I'm not sure, are you guys doing any of that today?
No, not.
What about
No, we're not either.
at Veritone?
Yeah, we don't build the model, but there are providers out there that do that. And to your point, Neil, I mean, we provide production services for the U.S. Open, and one of the things they do is one of those companies that monitors crowd interest. We correlate that as a piece of metadata so they can go back and say, okay, show me all of the chase reviews where the interest level was above X threshold. So there's different ways to kind of correlate those things, which are pretty neat.
Yeah. Question? Oh, go ahead.
Just maybe one point to that. I think there's a lot more sort of invasive use of this in advertising and technologies. I don't know if you saw that story a few months back about Cadillac Fairview installing, sort of advertising kiosks inside the malls, and camera there that was doing facial analysis, gender detection, racial detection, age detection, anonymizing the data. They've also put it in some elevators so that while everybody's kind of sitting there twiddling their thumbs, they're looking, if you're looking at the little advertising screens or whatever else. So, it's affecting a wide swath of our lives, whether we like it or not. And I think, this sort of leads into the Terminator question is what are these companies doing with the data? If you're maintaining it to help build and sustain the models and improve the models, it's one thing. If it's anonymized data, it's okay too. Google, obviously being in town down the road here, is a concern. A lot of people have had a lot of concerns around Sidewalk Labs and their ultimate objectives for, world AI dominance or whatever it is. So, we're at the early stage of it, but I think that, the regulators and governments and agencies have to sort of get around this pretty quickly. For identifying faces in broadcast content, it's one thing, but now if all of a sudden you're uniquely identifying fans in an audience, it could get into a little bit more of a gray area. Although they put a nice little sign about this big out the door saying this area is under video surveillance, but they don't tell you that they're going to hold on to and persist that data forever and monetize it and sell it and resell it, et cetera, et cetera.
Which is why we like being in media and entertainment. Rainbows. Rainbows and happy faces around all that. Look, there's definitely a slippery slope. It's the same technologies. Luckily, we're just doing it to try and make really fun content around all of those kind of things. We got one here.
So 2 years ago at NAB, I saw an example of that where Watson was being used to make all the cuts on the Masters golf tournament, where they were looking at the facial expression of the gallery to determine what putts were actually good putts. When everybody is acting surprised that it went in, that's a good cut. That was 2 years ago.
Michael?
So in the last 2 months, we've been walking away from facial recognition. The liabilities that GDPR and here in Canada and US have, we did it at the Masters, as you just said.
That's right. So, sorry, Michael's with IBM. It was the company I was referencing. But please go ahead.
So, but there's been a big sea change, a big pivot in the last 2 months. And I'm doing a big project right now, and we're going to proceed, but with no facial recognition. If they'll let us proceed with it, under that basis, we'll proceed. If they want facial, we're stepping away.
So instead, what are you using? Crowd noise, emotion?
There's lots of metadata, different attributes you can use to create a composite of that reaction. But the facial recognition has become a very dangerous thing to have. And in our company, at least, we're reconsidering it quite seriously.
And dangerous to store, right, as well,
Yeah.
around all of that.
We I've been using it out west, transit company, but I just took the metadata and I didn't record any video. I just wanted the metadata because I was counting turnstile jumpers at a transit company. And if we did the video, the process would have been 6-9 months. If we did the metadata, I was up and running in a couple of days. So, you know, there's pros and cons, but right now, there's a big rethink going on, not just by us.
What you said is actually a lot what Peter and Ryan were saying, right? In that case, you narrow down so that you can do something quickly versus trying to boil the ocean and then suddenly it turns into what are you really trying to do? Catch the exact person, or are you just trying to get the statistics on how much if this is happening, right? And that's the important part about it. Another one at the back, Ryan?
I wanted to just share a piece of information I came across a couple months ago, and this might be disappointing for senior management here. But in the U.S. right now, they estimate that, first of all, in all the computer science courses across the U.S., data science is the highest demand. They estimate there are short about 3 million positions for students and roughly 5 million workers in this field across all disciplines. And the average starting salary in the U.S. is starting at $150,000 now.
Absolutely.
So when you got to bring
400 in
California to do all of this, it's starting to add up a lot.
400 in the Bay Area.
Yeah, exactly. That's where you are. So you know, there's a lot of cost to this that might be coming up if you're fighting for talent.
Well, I think that was the point, right, that we were trying to make was how do we, in some of our traditional roles start to move into these areas, because you're absolutely right, there's going to be a massive gap. Well, we already have that gap today, right, around all of that.
I'll just add to that. We've been hiring a lot of people with statistics and math backgrounds, obviously, but I've been working with a woman who's a social anthropologist, and we've been bringing in a lot more what I'll call right-brain people to work with, right now all the AI, and again, we used to call it cognitive, but we surrendered to the AI term. We just couldn't keep going with cognitive. But we've been bringing in the mixture of left brain, right brain, because we were too polarized to the engineering domain. And we were getting like bias. We've started anti-bias tools now to take bias out of the programming. And there's been a whole bunch of things that we've had to do to pivot again in the last year to fix some of the early startup problems we had.
Well, if anybody remembers, that was it Microsoft released the AI online, and within 12 hours it was a racist, bigot, and it was horrible, and we had to take it out right away, right? It was just on Twitter alone, I think, around that. Those bias are important for us to keep check. HR companies are fighting with this today when they're using AI to skim through resumes and things like that as well.
It's in the Globe Mail this Thursday. I think there's a feature, a whole section on HR bias with AI.
Yeah, I think you have to look back a little bit and think about where does the vast majority of training data for natural language processing engines, for photo categorization, like it exists with bias just in its own right over the last many decades, right? So we're trying to be pretty careful about how a lot of that is categorized and classified. A couple of the people that we've partnered with have spent a lot of time to train that out. So for me, a lot of what this comes back to is back to that data idea, right? Is it cleansed properly? Who is managing that? Who are the people? Not even just building the models, but right back to the kinds of data sets you're training at. So important to think about. And on the talent side, I think our approach has been, try to build a lot of that capacity and horsepower inside the business. We have tons of talented folks. So rather than go out and spend $400,000 on a Ivy grad, let's build up some of the skills of our own people. You can do that through either really formalized training. You can do that by finding people who want to be engaged and involved in that and trying to foster those. Like there are lots of ways that we can get at trying to build the skill sets for ourselves. And that split between left brain and right brain folks, I think the more and more people have come and said, how do we get involved in this? How do I do my career development? Having people who can translate in between those two worlds. We've got subject matter experts on sort of both sides of the aisle, but having some folks that can operate in both spaces, I think, is going to become more important than it has been in the past.
I would just add that media and entertainment companies are the old school left brain, right brain organizations, right? Like production, creatives, and technology. It's like the the whole genesis of the industry. So in that respect, I think we already have a great natural mix in our organizations from that perspective.
We got time for one last question. Oh, the back.
It's not a quick question about the coding itself. Maybe this
A little bit louder.
Sorry, more of a question about the coding itself further out into the future. As things improve and we get into advanced, heuristic learning and synaptic modeling, all this, things that are coming down the pipes as we head towards Ray Kurzweil's singularity. But before we get there, do you see sort of a need for standardization, or do you think standardization will even occur as these islands are developed proprietary way?
Great question for a standardization group.
Maybe like something.
I think that's a great question. I mean, our approach has been to focus on normalization instead of standardization, and I think that's another way to kind of skin that cat. But I think there's going to be so much innovation to try and get all of these different engine providers and data scientists to agree on standards. There'll be some level of standardization, but I think having a way to normalize that is really important as well.
All right.
Pierre has a really good answer.
Do I?
I like it.
The only standard we should worry about is around protecting against the machines taking us over. That's probably where we should focus from a standardization perspective. The rest of it in this day and age, just it's all API based. Just stop trying to develop uniform ways of handling things. That's not the world we live in. It's an organic world, and we just need to recognize that. Standards were required in the past because of limits on the technology that we had. Those limits are fading fast. So I don't know that it's necessary. I think it's a wasted effort, to be honest. That's a provocative statement at SMPTE meeting. 2110, anyone?
Well, I think we'll give Michael one.
Just curious, because I haven't heard, machine learning's kind of mundane to us now. Deep learning is what we're really focused on, and the video stuff, we bought 8 video companies in the last year alone, just because we're trying to get in ingress and egress that way. But I haven't heard about maybe running Kubernetes, microservices. Are you doing cloud native on your system, or are you doing just the monolithic lift and park it in the cloud?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you bring up that point, because all the rage was microservices a couple of years ago, and now it's kind of gone to this serverless idea. And I mean, ultimately, what we're doing in there, I mean, it's stateful, arguably microservices, but built on the building blocks of containers and different things like that. I would say that it's probably not in its purest state that way, because then you get into this whole conversation about orchestration and the complexities around that. And maybe we ourselves fell victim to the offerings of the gods of Google and Microsoft and IBM Cloud, where building on tool sets that are API driven is a lot easier than worrying about building something maybe from the right architectural standpoint than from a pure architectural standpoint versus, maybe what's doable, usable, fastest, cheapest, leveraging the tools that are there already. We are doing containers, it's Kubernetes for what we're doing on our part of it, but the stuff that we've built up in AWS right now is just using the Lambda capabilities. It's all signaling on MQTT, it's all notification driven, stateful type stuff. But not purist microservices, let's say.
Okay, we're going to do the last question in the corner.
Yeah, I was reading an article last week, and at first I was laughing, but now more and more like with this panel. It was basically not about the fact that we should be worried or not necessarily. We should make sure that we brought a lot more diversity in the group of developers that are developing all these new technologies, in order to make sure that it doesn't end up being an artificial intelligence that's based on WASP. White Anglo-Saxon Protestant
values, if I can say that. So what do you think about that? Is this a guy who was trying to get clicks, or is there some value behind that? Or?
Being on the development side of the fence, I'll tell you that there's a lot less WASP developers than there are non-WASP developers today by 10 orders of, or 100 orders of magnitude, so I'm not so sure. Granted, maybe the CEOs of the organizations are predominantly WASP males, unfortunately, but from a development perspective, I don't see any fear. I think the biggest fear in deep learning and ML is really about the sample data, right? So if the sample data sets are predominantly captured in Western Europe and in North America, there is an inherent problem in those models. And I think for those of you that sort of saw the inception of what Google was doing with photos and all of the actual facial detections and things like that, they probably needed a little broader sense of training data. They ran into some troubles early on as well. So yes, but I think it's more about where you're getting your training data from more and your models from more so than the actual developer bias.
Great. Well, in there on a good but hard question. As we wrap up, I just did want to tell you I've already launched my new company, which is the machine learning Java blockchain AI in the cloud using stateless machines. It's now $15.95 because you can see how many words I have in there. Available, and I'm also available for sale. Should you be interested, Mike, in the near future. So there we go. I do want to thank the panel. What a ride tonight when you think about it. We went from being able to detect a Coke symbol in a machine to the Dark Overlord that may take us over one day, but that is the journey when you think about AI and machine learning. Please join me in thanking the panel as I give them their beautiful SMPTE certificates of participation for Thank you. Ryan, there you go. I expect that on your desk tomorrow.
Gift with purchase.
That's very thoughtful. Well, there you